Welcome to The Explainer. Let's just dive right into what is honestly a fascinating paradox about how our brains actually pick up a second language. For decades, educators and learners have been locked in this huge debate about the best way to master a new tongue. Do we sit down and memorize thick rule books, or do we just jump right in and start talking? Well, today we're going to look at the hard science and the actual classroom realities that answer that exact question.
So we've all heard this, right? It's a super popular idea, one you've probably hoped was true, that if we just completely surround adults or teenagers with endless language input, they'll just naturally soak up the grammar like a sponge. The theory, which was huge in the 1980s, was that acquiring a second language works exactly like learning our first language as babies. No tedious grammar lessons required. Sounds great, right? Well, science put that to the test.
Researchers actually looked at the data from English-speaking kids in Canadian French immersion schools, and the results were pretty surprising. These students had years of pure meaning-focused immersion. The result? Sure, they were confident, really fluent speakers with fantastic vocabularies. But they completely failed to acquire basic verb tenses, they struggled with function words like prepositions, and missed absolutely crucial sociolinguistic rules. It turns out, endless input simply wasn't enough to build structural accuracy.
So if endless input isn't the magic bullet, what is? How do we get that accuracy without killing the fluency? Well, here is our roadmap for today. First, the language learning dilemma. 2, focus on form versus form guess. 3, the noticing hypothesis. 4, the power of corrective feedback. And finally, 5, grammar in disguise.
All right, let's start with section 1, the language learning dilemma. Because to actually solve this problem, we first have to understand what is physically happening inside a learner's brain. Here's the psychological bottleneck we're dealing with. Second language learners, especially beginners, have a strictly limited processing capacity. When you're out there just trying to survive a conversation, your brain is absolutely in overdrive just trying to decode the core message. It prioritizes getting the basic meaning across, completely ignoring whether you use the correct past tense ending or the right article. Your brain basically says, hey, I don't have the bandwidth for grammar right now. I literally just need to know where the train station is.
Which leads us to section 2, focus on form versus form S. Now that difference might just look like a simple typo, but it represents entirely different philosophies of teaching.
On one side of the debate, we have the old school approach, focus on form S, with a capital S for isolated structures. This is your traditional textbook method. The main goal here is teaching specific rules, doing those repetitive drills, and treating language almost like a math equation to be solved completely outside of real communication. Let's be honest, it can be incredibly tedious. But on the flip side, we have the modern, dynamic solution, focus on form, without the S. This happens when grammar is seamlessly integrated right into meaning-oriented communicative activities. The grammar lesson naturally arises out of a genuine attempt to communicate.
So, why does this integrated approach work so incredibly well? It all comes down to a concept called form-meaning mapping. Think about the ed verb ending in English. It isn't just some random rule you have to memorize for a quiz. It's essentially a time travel marker for the past. When students are engaged in a real task and they suddenly realize, oh wait, I need a specific structure to make myself understood here, they map that grammatical form directly to its meaning in real time.
Moving on to section 3, the noticing hypothesis. This brings us to a fascinating cognitive requirement for why the older brain really needs this integrated approach.
And this is a brilliant insight from researcher Richard Smith. Learners must notice a language form before it can be learned. Simply put, no conscious noticing equals no learning. If a student hears a French verb conjugation literally 1,000 times but never consciously registers its pattern or purpose, it's just never going to enter their permanent linguistic system. We have to design learning so that students take a conscious timeout from pure meaning to briefly, actively notice the mechanics of the language.
And here is why this is actually incredible news for older learners. While babies learn implicitly, teenagers and adults have this superpower called metalinguistic awareness. If you're learning a language right now, this is absolutely your secret weapon. It means your analytic brain is primed to think abstractly, to reflect on language, and to consciously compare your first language with your new one. By specifically drawing attention to linguistic patterns, we actually speed up the language learning process, way beyond just waiting for natural immersion to take effect.
Okay, section 4, the power of corrective feedback. So the really crucial question here is, how do teachers force this noticing to happen without totally killing the vibe of a natural conversation?
Linguist Rod Ellis actually gives us a really great framework for this. Teachers can jump in fluidly to provide what's called negative evidence, which is really just a fancy way of telling the brain, hey, that pattern doesn't quite work in this language. They can do this reactively by responding to an error right after it happens, or preemptively by pausing to address a tricky form just before the students are going to need it. Both methods subtly restructure the learner's mental map of the language.
And within that reactive feedback bucket, teachers actually have a few different tools. Feedback can be conversational, where the teacher maybe pretends to not quite hear or understand, which gently forces the student to self-correct. Or it can be didactic, taking a brief, explicit pause for a mini-lesson. It can be implicit, like subtly recasting a mistake by repeating it back correctly without breaking the flow. Or it can be completely explicit, directly calling out that an error was made.
So let's actually look at how this plays out in real life. A student is talking and says, "In the theater, you can watch movie." The teacher casually steps in and says, "A better word here is cinema." The student immediately picks up on it and says, "Because in the cinema, you can watch movies." This right here is explicit, reactive feedback in action. It's brief, it corrects a specific gap exactly when the student needs it, and then boom, the conversation immediately keeps flowing.
All right, final section, number 5, grammar in disguise. Let's look at an absolute masterclass in taking all this theory and applying it to a highly engaging classroom activity.
Because theory is great, but execution is everything. Take a teacher named Shona, for example. She had to teach a highly complex unit on Japanese grammar to a bunch of teenagers. Instead of handing out boring worksheets, she disguised the entire unit as a high-stakes murder mystery. The premise? The deputy principal has been murdered, and the students are the detectives who have to solve the case. Shona completely stopped being the teacher and essentially became the police chief.
To solve the crime, these student detectives had to establish a timeline of events. But to do that, they needed to understand how Japanese expresses the concept of doing something before something else. Instead of just giving them the rule, she gave them a starter sheet to deduce it entirely themselves. Step 1, translate these sentences. Step 2, actively deduce the grammatical formula based on those patterns. Step 3, write your own. The students had to actively crack the grammatical code just to get their next clue.
And it went even further. To decode suspect interviews, the detectives had to classify Japanese verb types. To practice those timeline skills, they played a before sentences board game where teammates had to carefully listen and correct each other's grammar to advance. To identify suspects, they had to complete complex sentences using Japanese verbs for wearing different types of clothing. They learned the structural forms simply because they desperately needed to convey the meaning to catch the killer.
This whole brilliant setup is summed up perfectly by language expert Jim Scrivener, who notes that people learn way more by doing things themselves rather than just being told about them. It totally relies on the levels of processing hypothesis. When you're just passively handed a rule, it sits right on the surface of your mind, but the intense mental effort required to solve a grammar puzzle, to induce a rule from scratch, that forces deep cognitive processing. That mental sweat is exactly what makes the grammar stick permanently.
Ultimately, what this research shows us is that language teaching isn't some strict binary. You absolutely do not have to choose between boring grammar drills for accuracy on one hand and fun, messy role plays for fluency on the other. Focus on form elegantly blends both. By integrating brief, targeted moments of linguistic noticing right into highly engaging communicative tasks, we build speakers who are both incredibly fluent and structurally accurate.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. Whether you are a teacher designing a curriculum or a student trying to hack your own language learning journey, the challenge is pretty clear. Meaning must drive the learning, but the form must be noticed. So, I leave you with this provocative thought. How will you disguise your next grammar lesson? Thank you so much for joining us, and keep learning.